Hello everyone, today we're going to be going over the August 2024 Living Environment Regents Exam. In this video, we're going to be going over Part C, which is 17 short response questions, each worth 1 point. A link to this test can be found in the description of the video if you want to follow along at home, and a link to a video going over the next part of this test can also be found there if you want to keep going over this exam after this video ends. That being said, we're going to start off with 56, which actually starts with this long passage over here. It reads that before humans arrived in New Zealand, forests covered over 80% of the land. When the Maori people arrived around 1250 AD, they burned off large numbers of trees to clear area for land and for other uses. European traders later logged large areas exporting the timber, and by the time the European settlements began to appear, forests covered only 50% of the country. The cutting of native forests continued for many years, and by 2005 only 25% was covered by native forests. Today, the cutting of native forests has nearly stopped, and the timber industry now uses several imported species of pine and other conifers from North America. These non-native wilding pines have provided lumber industries with trees to grow for export to sustain this important industry. Some of the wilding species were also planted in other areas to solve erosion problems on hilly slopes. However, because each tree can produce as many as 15,000 light seeds, these introduced trees soon spread to many new areas. They competed successfully with many native plants for light and water, often crowding native plants out completely. Their uncontrolled spread continues, and it is predicted they will cover up to 20% of the entire country in about 20 years. The photo below shows the pines invading both lowland and highland elevation areas. So in this case, you see these trees, right, these pines down here and down here, and this is the low level, and then all of these pines were planted up here, and that's high level elevation because they're on these hills and mountains, right? So they're invading. They haven't grown fully yet, but they are taking over the landscape and over these native species. So what this passage pretty much told us is that in New Zealand, people it had a very large forest coverage, and then people started to cut down these forests. And then when they cut down the forests, they eventually imported new trees to cut those trees down instead of the native ones, and then eventually the trees that they imported to cut down spread to other parts, and it became an invasive species. So they introduced an invasive species onto the country, and then it outcompeted the native plants even more. Many efforts to control the spreading wilding pines have been tied to varying degrees of success. These include the use of poisonous herbicides, cutting individual scattered trees, or large areas of trees. Recently, a study was conducted to determine if grazing animals, so sheep and cows, could be used to destroy wilding pine seedlings. Sheep, a common farm animal in New Zealand, were placed in several enclosures containing newly planted wilding pine seedlings. The number of sheep in each enclosure varied from a normal herd size 1x up to 8 times 8x. That the number of sheep, so 8 times that number of sheep. This was the stocking rate for each enclosures. Conditions such as similar as the number of seedlings and enclosure size were proportionally adjusted to prevent overcrowding. The results of the study are summarized in the graph below. So pretty much this was a big preamble, a big introduction to the fact that New Zealand has these invasive species of trees, and that they're trying to see how they can minimize this invasion. How can they do that? Well, they can introduce sheep into these areas, and maybe sheep can eat the seedlings or the seeds the way that the tree reproduces, and if it eats the seedlings, the trees won't be able to reproduce and actually spread to more parts of the environment, more parts of the country. Okay, so you can see that relative reduction in height is how much they are eating the seedlings, and this rate goes up as you increase the herd size. So the stocking rate is just how many sheep are in each herd, and the 1x represents the standard size of a herd, and the 8x represents 8 times the standard rate of a herd. And we can see here that the probability of survival for a seedling actually decreases or goes down with the stocking rate, or with the number of sheep that you place in the environment. That makes sense because the more sheep are there, the more mouths can eat the invasive species, right? So 56 says use the data from one or both graphs to describe the effective stocking rate of sheep on seedlings of those wilding pines. Well, we just said that the probability that a seedling will survive decreases as sheep stocking rates go up, right? So as stocking rate is increased, the probability of seedling survival decreases, okay? That's just one of the graphs that you needed to interpret here. You could also interpret here, as stocking rate increases or goes up, the relative reduction in height also increases, right? So those two are related. So these types of problems are just asking you to analyze two graphs and describe their relationship, okay? So either one of those would give you full points here. 57 says, explain how the introduction of the wilding pine trees had both positive and negative effects in New Zealand. So one of the positive effects was that they were able to stop landslides, right? Or erosion, right? Some wilding pine species, pines were also planted in other areas to help solve erosion problems, okay? So one positive effect was that, and that should be effect, was that the trees reduced erosion. Okay, so that's one positive effect it had. They reduced the erosion in the country, and they also supported the lumber industry. That would technically be another positive effect. They helped the economy, right? However, the trees became an invasive species and hurt native species, right? So the trees became invasive, which is one negative effect, right? The species were out of control, right? Even though we planted them in a certain area of the country, let's say over here, then the trees managed to spread to the rest of the country, and then they hurt the native species by outcompeting them for resources. And one positive effect of this was, well, for the time that they were planted in the area that we did, well, it reduced erosion in that area, and then they came out of control, and then they kind of ruined the balance of species in the country. Okay, so it asks us to base your question, your answer to 58 on the information below and your knowledge of biology. The graphs below show the change in biotic and abiotic factors in New York State. Right, so over here, changes in a New York State lake. So the amount of dissolved oxygen decreases. So dissolved oxygen is just the amount of oxygen inside of a body of water. Should probably make that blue. Why is that important? Well, fish breathe oxygen, believe it or not. They breathe oxygen that's stored inside of water, right? That's what gills are for. Gills filter out the oxygen that's inside of the water, okay? So what's happening here is that this oxygen is going down. The amount of oxygen in the water is going down as the sewage waste in the water goes up. And this one shows the population of fish throughout the year. So both of these graphs are representing events that are happening at the same time, right? They're starting at 1950, they're ending at 1970, and what you could see here is that pretty much every single fish, except for the carp, decreased in population size as the amount of dissolved oxygen decreased. And that makes sense because if there's less oxygen inside of the water, then the fish have less oxygen to breathe, and less fish can be supported inside of the environment, okay? So using the information from the graphs, state a likely reason why the population of trout and whitefish, so trout and whitefish, disappeared around the 1960s. So what happened here is that the trout population dropped to zero, and so did the whitefish population at the time where the oxygen level was at a point of decrease, right? So number one, the 1960s was a time of high sewage waste, right? Sewage waste was increasing, and the fish probably couldn't survive in sewage waste. And another factor here is the fact that the fish were living in a time where the water didn't necessarily have a lot of oxygen inside of it. So we can say that trout and whitefish were not adapted / could not survive in environments with low oxygen content. The entire issue here is that there's low oxygen in the water, and as a result, the fish simply don't have the proper gills they didn't adapt the proper gills to survive in that environment. Or you could say that, well, the fish couldn't survive with the amount of sewage waste that was in the water, right? The sewage waste increased from 1950 to 1960, so the population of both of these decreased. Okay? It asks us to base our answer to 59 on the information below. After fertilization, the development of a human embryo involves many interacting factors. As a result, an embryo gradually develops with a variety of multicellular structures. Other than avoiding drugs or toxic substances, identify one action a pregnant woman can take and explain how that action could have a positive effect on her fetus. Okay? So, well, aside from, not smoking cigarettes or, being next to toxic waste, what's one thing that can help the baby develop? There's a lot of things that can help a baby develop, right? Things that hurt baby development is drinking alcohol, right? Fetal alcohol syndrome is a real thing. Taking drugs while you're pregnant also can get your baby hooked on drugs or change their development. It can make them come out extremely small. Same thing with smoking cigarettes. It makes your children have a very low birth rate. Drinking alcohol changes the way that their face and brain is developed. So all of these things can affect child development. What's one positive thing that you can do? Well, you can have a healthy diet. The same way how ingesting or taking or drinking alcohol, putting alcohol into your body can hurt your child, eating healthy can help your child. So we can say that one positive thing that a pregnant woman can do to help her fetus is to having a healthy and proper diet to provide, or you can take diets and supplements. Having a healthy and proper diet and taking certain vitamins to give the fetus enough nutrients to develop properly. Okay, so that's pretty much the main idea here. The same way that you can ingest bad stuff for your baby, you can ingest good stuff for your baby. So a diet is the stuff that you ingest. So if you have a healthy diet, you're ingesting or you're eating good things that are going to enter your fetus, and if it's good things that are entering your fetus, and things that the fetus needs, like certain vitamins, certain supplements, and healthy food, then the baby will have the nutrients and the proper nutrients to develop normally. Okay. Number 60 asks us to read this. So it says that some research indicates that there is a 75% increase in the risk of developing skin cancer if an individual starts using tanning devices such as tanning beds before the age of 30. Since these devices use UV radiation, a federal government agency has issued a proposal to reclassify UV radiation emitting tanning devices as a category that has stricter regulations. State one reason why the use of these devices could increase the risk of developing skin cancer. Well, where does cancer come from? Cancer is an uncontrolled division of the cells, right? Cancer, a cancer cell has something wrong with it that makes it unable to stop multiplying, right? And eventually the cell, this one cancer cell who can't stop dividing, divides into another identical cancer cell that also can't stop dividing, and then into another one that can't stop dividing, and so on and so forth, until you have so many cells that it's literally blocking your body, and it turns into a tumor, right? So you have a large tumor full of cancer cells that continues to grow, and it presses against certain parts of your body, which inhibits their functions. And if it's a tumor cell of an organ, well, it stops that organ from functioning because all the healthy cells are now overpowered or replaced with tumor cells that are non-functioning. Okay, so one thing in a leading cause of cancer is a mutation in the cells, right? A certain part of the cell's DNA that controls their division. It's a poorly piece drawn of DNA, but let's just say that this is the DNA of a cell, and let's say that this red zone is the part of the DNA that says, hey, stop dividing. This is the part that controls division. The issue with UV radiation is that it's radiation, and usually radiation causes mutations. So if you have all of these harsh UV rays attacking your your DNA, what's going to happen is sometimes it can cause mutations. It can delete these bands over here that control cell division, and because those bands are deleted, or that part of the DNA is going to be deleted, you're not going to be able to effectively control how much and how frequently your cell divides, so you're going to divide forever and ever and ever. That's just one example of something that could happen. But again, UV radiation can cause mutations in the cell, which can lead to uncontrolled cell division, which is cancer. In parentheses, right? That's what cancer is, okay? You could also say that radiation can cause damage to genetic information, causing the cells to become cancerous. You can say that UV radiation can alter DNA in skin cells, making them cancerous, right? So as long as you mention that UV radiation can cause some sort of damage to DNA or some sort of mutation in DNA that results in those cells being unable to control how much they divide, that's enough to get full credit here, okay? So 61 is going to rely off of this article of naked mole rats. It says that the unique traits of the naked mole rat make it the focus of research. Found in the hot, dry grasslands of East Africa, they live underground in tunnel systems in social colonies of 20 to 300. They are well adapted for life underground, with protruding teeth for digging, small eyes, and the ability to survive without oxygen up to 18 minutes. So they have all of these adaptations. They feed primarily on very large tubers, underground plant stems, and rely on bacteria in their intestine to break down the indigestible meaning you cannot digest it, plant fibers. Although most small rodents live only a few years, naked mole rats can live up to 30 years. Unlike most mammals that maintain a constant body temperature despite external conditions, mole rats cannot regulate their body temperature. Researchers have found that they are resistant to the pain caused by venom injected by aggressive ants that share their burrow systems, okay? So they do not feel pain from venom by these ants that also live inside of these tunnels, okay? Analysis has shown that naked mole rats have variation in the membranes of nerve cells that block pain signals from the venom. Based on this information from the reading, describe one advantage that the mole rats have by living in underground tunnels. Well, in this case, if they live in underground tunnels, they don't have to regulate their own body temperature, because naturally the underground or the ground is going to be a lot colder or cooler than the hot above ground, right? The sun is going to be able to it directly hits the ground, but the sun rays don't necessarily penetrate that deep into the ground where these tunnels are, right? So the mole rat tunnels are far enough underneath the ground that the sun's rays don't penetrate it and thus don't heat it up as much, right? So unlike most mammals that maintain a constant body temperature despite external conditions, mole rats cannot regulate their body temperature because they don't need to. They live far underneath the ground where they don't need to waste energy, sweating or shivering, because the ground is always at a constant temperature, okay? So one of these advantages is that the temperature underground is more consistent than the outside. And another advantage to this is the fact that they eat these tubers, right? These plant stems that grow underground. They don't need to go outside to go ahead and get their food. Their food literally comes to them, right? Their food is found in the tunnels. So that's another advantage. 62 asks us to describe how the relationship between the mole rat and the intestinal bacteria is positive for both. Well, the intestinal bacteria allow the mole rat to digest indigestible parts of the plant. Without the bacteria, the mole rats wouldn't be able to break down certain parts of the stem. So the bacteria get a place to live, right? The bacteria, number one, get a place to live inside of the mole rat's stomach, and number two, the bacteria also get nutrients from digesting that indigestible part of the plant. If you're eating this plant and especially its stem, certain parts of the stem, when you break it down into your stomach, cannot be broken down to and will make it sick, right? So let's say that you're able to eat this part of the stem, but not the squiggly part on the inside. The bacteria will then eat that squiggly part of that stem and turn it into nutrients for you to absorb while they absorb some of the nutrients, and your normal stomach can continue to absorb this into more nutrients. So the bacteria is happy because it gets nutrients from the mole rat eating, and the mole rat is happy because now it can digest parts of the stem that it couldn't before. So the relationship is positive for both because both mole rats and the bacteria can absorb nutrients after the bacteria digest the plant fibers. Okay? But you could also say that mole rats eat the tubers, and the bacteria then digest the tubers. So the mole rat provides the bacteria with food, and the bacteria digest that food and provides nutrients for the mole rat. So any sort of thing like that, right? The mole rats and the bacteria both benefit because they both get fed in this action. Okay? So 63 says mole rats more effectively repair DNA errors than mice. Explain why scientists claim this contributes to the longer lifespan of moles compared to mice. Well, DNA errors can lead to mutations, and without repaired or proper DNA, you can die quicker. Because remember, your DNA is what your body uses to make more of itself, right? The DNA is this large, blueprint that our body uses to repair itself. So if the blueprint you're using is faulty or incorrect, you will produce incorrect parts for yourself, right? You will produce less effective parts for yourself. You will produce damaged parts. If your DNA that codes for the skin is damaged, then you'll produce damaged skin, and that'll be less strong, and you'll get more cuts, or it'll be more irritated, and as a result, you'll live a shorter lifespan, okay? So you can say that without repairing damaged DNA, there could be a greater risk of earlier death. You could say that DNA repair genes produces enzymes that repair certain mutations that might cause cancer. Damaged DNA can lead to disruption of homeostasis. You can even say that, right? So damaged DNA that is not repaired can lead to early death and shorten lifespans because damaged DNA disrupts homeostasis. Right, so if you want to put big vocabulary there, homeostasis is definitely a big word that you want to use on the regents, right? So mole rats more effectively repair DNA errors than mice. So because they're able to get rid of this damaged DNA that can lead to early death, right? Because this damaged DNA disrupts homeostasis, because they can get rid of that more reliably and more frequently, these mole rats can live for longer. Okay? Base your answers to 64 and 65 on the information below, right? So an increase in the glucose level in the blood causes a release of insulin. Insulin signals the liver to absorb excess glucose. In order to store it, the liver then synthesizes glycogen from glucose. When blood sugar is low, the liver breaks the large glycogen molecules back into glucose and release it into the bloodstream for use by the cells. Diagram below illustrates how a person normally metabolizes glucose, okay? So glucose, if there's a lot of glucose, or glucose just means sugar. So if there's a lot of sugar in the intestine, right, which is where your nutrients are going to be broken down, then that will trigger the liver, which is this organ right here, to turn that extra glucose into glycogen. And when there's not enough glucose in the bloodstream, then the liver will break down this glycogen back into glucose and release it into the bloodstream, okay? So low sugar you have to break glycogen, and high sugar, you have to make glycogen. Okay? People with glycogen storage disease, GSD, cannot break glycogen down, so they can't access their stored glucose. It is essentially locked in the liver. Symptoms of this disease include low blood sugar, poor growth, and weakness. Currently, one of the treatments for children with GSD is to drink a starch solution several times a day. Explain how drinking a starch solution several times a day can help maintain homeostasis for a person with glycogen storage disease. Well, that's because the starch can be broken down into glucose for the body, right? So remember, starches can be digested into sugars. Starches are molecules that are made up of many, many sugars. So in a sense, that's just another form of glycogen, okay? Now, is it made up of a lot of glucose? No, it's made up of it's made up of a different sugar, but in essence, that sugar can still be used to fuel your body, okay? So drinking a starch solution can provide which can be broken down into usable sugar for energy. Remember that starches and sugars a starch is just a lot of sugar combined into one molecule, right? So when someone with GSD has low blood sugar, the starch can be digested back into other sugars or digested back into glucose if it's a specific type of starch, right? So the starch can be broken down into glucose for the body to use, since people with GSD can't access their stored glucose, right? So drinking a starch solution can provide the body with that glucose that they can't access, right? 65. Explain why glucose is able to be absorbed across the membrane, but glycogen is unable to be absorbed unless it's broken down. Well, think about it, right? Glycogen is, if one of these hexagons represents glucose, glycogen is a long chain of these glucoses, right? So it's a very long chain of these hexagons, which means that glycogen is a lot bigger than glucose. And the cell membrane is really good at letting small things enter and exit it. Small molecules, that is, small nonpolar molecules. Now, glycogen is far too big to be able to comfortably pass through this membrane quickly. So one reason why glucose is able to be absorbed across cell membranes but glycogen isn't is because glycogen is much bigger than glucose. Okay, so glycogen is too large to be absorbed, or glucose is smaller than glycogen. Glycogen is much bigger than glucose. So again, all of these large molecules need to be broken down into their smaller parts, or smaller or original parts, first in order for them to be absorbed across the cell membrane. The cell membrane is really good at absorbing small molecules. So if you have a long chain of molecules, you need to break them down into their individual parts in order for them to be absorbed across the membrane. Okay? Base your answers to 66 through 68 on the information below about wildebeests. Located in southern Africa, wildebeests are the largest member of the antelope family. Weighing from 260 to 595 pounds, in some parts of southern Africa, their population is decreasing. Their natural predators include lions, hyenas, cheetahs, and African wild dogs. Humans are disrupting the wildebeest habitat by putting up fences. However, in Serengeti National Park, where the population has been studied and monitored since the 1960s, the herd has experienced a rapid increase in population. A successful vaccination program had been developed to protect cattle that had passed the deadly disease called Rinderpest to the wildebeest. This vaccine is one of the contributing factors for this population increase. The trend in the graph below indicates the carrying capacity for the wildebeest that was reached in 1975. So the carrying capacity is kind of this limit, this population limit for a group of animals, right? It's how much the population can support, right? So there's These wildebeests need grass to graze on, they need water to drink, they need space to actually live in their habitat. The habitat has so much space and a certain limited amount of food, in this case grass, and a limited amount of water. So if the population goes above this carrying capacity, then a lot of them begin to starve because they overgraze, they eat all of the grasses, or they drink all of the water, right? At a rate that the environment cannot replenish, that cannot give back. Okay, so that's the carrying capacity. It's this invisible, think about it like a speed limit or a population limit, a size limit. This population cannot be any greater than 1.3 million, because when it is greater than that number, well, what happens is they overcompete, and there's not enough resources, and they die out. And essentially, this wasn't even an issue until in the 1960s, they developed this vaccine, right? A vaccine gives you immunity against certain viruses or certain diseases, okay? So up until this point, which I'm going to say actually, that's not 1960. 1960 was over here. Let's say 1960 is over here. So anytime before this, the population was even lower, because they would just the wildebeest would just get killed off by that disease, right? By that virus or whatnot. Then they introduced this vaccine, which now protects the wildebeest against early death, right? They don't get sick anymore, so they can live their full life and reproduce. And you can see over time, as they rolled out this vaccine, as they vaccinated more wildebeests, they were able to live longer, reproduce more, live fuller lives, and their population skyrocketed, okay? So describe two different factors that limited the size of the wildebeest population, one before and one after the vaccination program. Well, one thing that limited their population size before was the disease. So before the program, the Rinderpest disease limited, right? Because they would just get killed off by the disease. Because if you had so many wildebeest in such close proximity with one another, so close to one another, the disease would spread really quickly between member to member, and the population would just die out. So before the program, the disease limited the population, and after the vaccine, the habitat or the food supply limited the size of the population, right? So after the vaccine or after the program, the amount of food in the environment, or the amount of resources in the environment, limited the population. So that would be the normal carrying capacity, right? Carrying capacity is usually the limit it's when the environment reaches its limit, right? The animals in the environment, take too much, and the environment can no longer support that size because they're taking too many of the resources that are found inside of the environment. All right. So 67 says, seeing the rate of the population increase between 1971 and 1975, some scientists became concerned and started to think that they might have to do something to slow this trend. Explain why the scientists might have thought that the rapid population increase can have negative environmental effects. Well, like I said before, when you have too many animals, they can overgraze or overuse the resources in the environment, right? Which means that other animals that share food with these animals can't really survive, right? So the animals might use up all of the food in the environment, or all of the food or resources, you can also say resources, which could damage the wildebeest and other animal populations. Right? So the main issue here is that, well, if all of the animals in this environment share the same water source or share the same food source, then because this population grows so big, they will take away all of that water, not only for themselves but for other species, right? So not only will this population go back down because they're all starving each other because they're all competing for the same food, but other populations and other species will also be starved because they're being over competed with for that same food. Okay, so 68 says some biologists claim that the rapid population growth would not negatively affect the wildebeest population and decided not to interfere and let the herd grow. Describe the evidence from the graph that supports their claim. Well, they're saying that whatever, just let them grow quickly and just let nature do its work, and that's exactly what happened. Why are they correct? Well, if they didn't do anything to prevent this, sure, the population did go above the carrying capacity and they did starve, and the population then eventually decreased, but it sorted itself out, right? The population kind of found its own balance, right? It hit the carrying capacity and it's now, existing slightly underneath the carrying capacity. So taking no action and letting nature fix itself did technically work. So the graph pretty much shows that the size of the population remains stable from, in this case, 1978. Not 1978. Hold on. It stayed stable from 1987 to 1991, right? So it stabilized below the carrying capacity. Okay. So in this case, some biologists claim that the rapid population would negatively impact the population, but it hasn't because the population has been stable. Okay. So the graph shows how the population has remained stable from the 1970s to the 1990s, despite the original rapid growth. So these guys some people were like, no, just because they grow extremely quickly doesn't necessarily mean that, the population will just explode or implode or not go anywhere. That's not true, right? Why? Because eventually it'll stabilize. And what the graph shows you is starting from the 1970s, or more specifically, I wouldn't say the 1970s, but somewhere closer to, 1978. I would change my answer to closer to from 1978 to the 1990s. This population actually was pretty stable, right? It fluctuated between this point and this point, which is a small height compared to the rest of the graph, right? So you didn't really need to do anything because the population just randomly fixed itself. Okay. So yeah, base your answers to 69 and 70 on the passage below and your knowledge of biology. The sand tiger shark gives birth to 2 offspring at a time every 2 years. The female reproductive tract consists of a uterus with 2 separate chambers that each may contain 16 to 23 eggs. After the eggs are fertilized, each developing embryo receives nourishment from its own yolk sac. There is never a placental connection between the mother and the embryos. I should probably be highlighting that. So there's never a placental connection between the mother and the embryos. Approximately 5 months into the year-long gestation, the food from the yolk sac is used up. The embryos then have to find a new source of nutrition. By this point, the embryos have developed teeth. The strongest embryo will then cannibalize, aka eat, the other embryos in the same uterine chamber until all but one of the embryos remain in each uterine section. At the completion of perinatal development, the female shark will give birth to only 2 offspring, each from one part of the uterus. So essentially what happens is you have these 2 chambers inside of the uterus that each contain 16 to 32 eggs. And at some point there's this yolk inside of the egg. Let's make that a yellow. It's like a regular egg. It's a yolk. And what this yolk does is it gives these eggs or these developing fetuses some sort of nutrients, right? So you have these sharks or these eggs that are developing. And eventually what happens is, well, these 2 uteruses, the yolk that's there that's providing nutrition for the shark, well, they get eaten up. And now you have all of these hungry, developing sharks inside of these uteruses that now need new food. And it just so happens that they develop teeth around this age. So the only source of food is themselves, so they begin to eat one another until there's only two embryos surviving, and then they gives birth to, two sharks, or two baby sharks, if you could imagine that's a shark. So 69 is asking, other than cannibalism, identify one way the development of a sand tiger shark embryo is different from the development of the human species. Well, one of the first things that I underlined here or highlighted here was that the embryo received nourishment from yolk sacs, and that there's never a placental connection between the mother and the embryo. In a human development, the umbilical cord, that's the thing that used to emanate from your belly button, runs from the placenta to the fetus at all time. Okay, so the fetus is always connected to this placenta, and through this, the placenta gives the fetus oxygen plus nutrients. And this link, this umbilical cord, then carries CO2 plus waste from the fetus into the placenta, where it's then expelled by the mother, right? So sharks don't have this connection between the placenta and the fetus, right? Humans do. So sharks, or actually human developments, involves a placental connection. Shark development does not. Okay. Another example is the fact that shark development takes a year and human development takes about 9 months. Shark development or shark reproduction produces two sharks. If a mother gives birth to two babies, they're twins, that's usually really rare. Usually humans only give birth to one baby. And finally, humans don't use yolk sacs. We use a placenta. Okay, so 70 says, identify one reproductive adaptation of the female sand tiger shark anatomy and discuss how this provides an advantage to the species. Well, they have two uterine chambers, which allows for the development of more offspring. Okay, so it's always good to have more offspring, because that increases the likelihood that you can, produce more of yourself, right? And it increases the likelihood that your offspring will survive. If you have a lot of offspring, then if one of them dies, you still have another offspring that will be able to live on and survive, unlike the other one did. So one advantage is that the sharks have two uterine chambers that allow for the development of more offspring. Okay? Again, these uterine chambers also are inside of the shark. They're not external, which means that because the sharks are developing internally, it's a safer habitat for the embryo. No one can come up and snatch the eggs if the shark just deposited eggs onto the ocean floor and swam away, right? This is all happening inside of a shark. So because it's happening inside of the mother, it's a lot safer than just having an egg that's laid and placed. Okay, so 71 and 72 are going to use these two graphs, right? Change in Greenland ice sheet mass. So change in the ice sheet mass, billions of metric tons, and here is the year that's going closer to the present time. And you can see that the change is negative, right? So if the change is negative, we're losing something. We're losing billions of metric tons of ice sheet mass. So the mass is decreasing by billions of tons, right? So in this case, you can see that it's a pretty steady decrease downward. Sure, it goes down and up, down and up, down and up, down and up, but even though it's going down and up, it's still reaching a crazy low number, a pretty low number compared to where it started, okay? So we're always decreasing by a rate of, but we're decreasing at an increasing rate. So if that doesn't make sense to you, we're going down by more and more each year. Okay, and this is atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration at the Mauna Loa Observatory. So in this case, we're observing the level of CO2 over time, and we see that there's this positive trend where as the year increases, the concentration of CO2 also increases. Here it's asking us to state the trend indicated by the data regarding the Greenland ice sheet and identify one likely human activity that contributed to this trend. So one trend indicated by the data regarding the Greenland ice sheet. So we're not focusing on this, we're focusing on this, right? So the trend indicates that the Greenland ice sheet mass is decreasing. Okay, so that's what the trend indicates. So the trend indicates that the mass of the Greenland ice sheet is decreasing, and one human activity that can be linked to this is, well, what makes ice melt? Higher temperatures make ice melt. So climate change, right? But that's not a human activity. What human activity can increase the global temperature is the burning of fossil fuels. Okay, so fossil fuels release carbon dioxide and heat, and that heat gets trapped inside of our atmosphere, and that CO2 also gets trapped inside of our atmosphere, which creates a greenhouse effect. So the heat from the sun ends up getting trapped. That CO2 traps the heat that the sun and its rays are getting or shooting towards the earth. It's getting trapped. That heat is no longer able to escape the Earth's atmosphere because of that CO2, and as a result, the world heats up. Okay, 72 says explain why increasing our use of solar energy worldwide could result in a decrease in global temperatures. Well, increasing solar energy decreases our use of fossil fuels, which limits CO2 production and slows global warming. So the issue with this is that we burn so many fossil fuels for energy. For example, oil-based energy and gas-based energy, that all of that releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. When that carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere, it traps heat. But if we start using solar energy and solar panels, we no longer need to rely on fossil fuels like gas and oil for energy anymore. We have a replacement. So if we use less of this oil and gas energy, less CO2 will be emitted, and it will slow global warming because, again, this carbon dioxide in our atmosphere is what traps the heat from the sun and it pretty much heats the world. Okay, so I understand that this video was long. For those of you that kept watching up until this point, thank you for watching. If you have any questions about anything that I explained over here, please let me know in the comments below. I'll try to explain them and get to your questions as quickly as possible. I hope you guys learned something. This section is pretty tedious. Again, it's just a lot of reading, and being able to see a relationship between graphs. So I'm telling you that usually the information or the answers to the questions are usually given away in the reading or in the graph. You just need to know how to put 2 and 2 together. Again, if you want to keep on going over this problem, the next video is going to be shorter and it's a lot simpler than the stuff that we talked about here. So again, that link to that video is in the description of this one. Again, thanks for watching. If you have any questions, leave them down below. I hope you guys learned something, and I hope you have a nice day.